Greetings and welcome to NSAI's Knowledge Transfer Series of webinars. This webinar is the first in a series of 4 webinars for placing products on the EU market. It is a simple introductory guide to CE marking, providing a simplified interpretation of very complex legislation across a range of products. But ultimately, the economic operator is responsible for compliance. The guide is divided into 4 key areas. The talk today focuses on how the system works, the 6 steps to CE mark your product, notified bodies, NANDO, and a very important document, the Declaration of Conformity, and how to apply the CE mark. The next module will outline who are economic operators, including manufacturers, importers, and distributors, and their roles and responsibility. In the third module, the focus will be on information you need to know about the intricacies of EU legislation for different products. And in the last module, you will hear about the impact of Brexit in terms of CE marking and what you can do to protect your business. There are 5 components to the system. Firstly, the EU drafts regulation, which sets out the basic requirements which must be met to place the product on the EU market. These requirements are generally there to stop the products injuring people or causing damage to property. However, in some cases they fulfill other functions. For example, in the Radio Equipment Directive, they are focused on protecting the radio spectrum and preventing interference with other radio equipment. Secondly, you show that your product meets the requirements of the regulation by showing that it meets the standards associated with the regulation. Thirdly, some products can cause significant injury to people or damage to property, and these are subject to tighter regulation. You are required to use an independent body, a notified body, to assess the conformity of your products. Fourthly, you make a legal declaration, the Declaration of Conformity, that the product meets the requirements of the regulation, and you can then CE mark the product. The CE mark is a visual confirmation for retailers, customers, and regulatory authorities that the product has been placed legally on the market. And finally, market surveillance is carried out to remove substandard products from the market, keep the customers safe, and protect manufacturers who abide by the rules. Within the EU, there is a comprehensive regulatory framework to operate effectively for the safety and compliance of industrial products, to protect the various public interests, and for the proper functioning of the single market. Now, Decision 768 back in 2008 gives legal effect to what is known as the new legislative framework, and this sets out a system which includes accreditation, product certification, harmonized standards, market surveillance, and CE marking. You can see the CE mark circled in green on the mask. This shows that the manufacturer is declaring that this mask meets all of the essential requirements set out in the relevant regulation, in this case PPE regulation. It indicates compliance with relevant EU directives and regulations. It allows the manufacturer to place the products on the EU market. The CE mark must be placed on the product even if it is manufactured outside of the EU, and it removes technical barriers to trade throughout the EU, primarily certification with declaration of conformity by the manufacturer. There are 6 main stages to CE marking, and we will briefly examine each of them. In most cases, except for construction, products do not have to be tested to the European standard known as EN to be placed on the market. However, compliance with EN is a way of demonstrating compliance with the regulations. Ultimately, the economic operators must comply with the regulation, not the standard. So I'm going to go through the 6 steps, and the first step is to identify the applicable directives. There are 32 directives covering different product categories. These range from medical devices, which are tightly regulated, to low voltage electrical devices, which are certified by the manufacturer. You need to see if your product is subject to one of these directives, regulations. You also need to check if it is excluded. For example, plugs and sockets are excluded from the low voltage directive. They are covered by national regulations rather than the EU regulation. Another example would be motorcycle helmets, which are excluded from the PPE regulation, personal protective equipment, as they are regulated by an international agreement rather than EU legislation. The second step, check the product specification. You should then check the exact requirements set out in the regulation and the standards that would demonstrate that your product conforms to the regulations. In most cases, your product will be required to conform to harmonized European standards, which are published in the EU's official journal. If there are no harmonized standards, you will then have to use another standard. You will then need to work down through a hierarchy of standards to find the correct one. If there is a standard published by a recognized international standards organization, you should use that, such as ISO or IEC, or European standards organizations such as CEN, CENELEC and ETSI. If there is no international European standard, you should use the national standard of an EU member state. For some products, you can choose a member state, but for some products, national legislation may limit your choice. A clear example of this are Irish plugs and sockets. They are covered by Irish legislation and national wiring rules, which restricts your choice to either Irish or British standards, as the same plugs and sockets are in both countries. In this case, you could not use a German standard, as that covers a different type of socket and plug, a 2-pin. And finally, if there are no national standards, you should use the most appropriate trade or commercial standard. Our third step, identify the correct module and if a notified body is required. Each regulation sets out the different test modules that must be used. There are 16 modules labelled from A to H1, which set out different requirements to demonstrate conformity. Some models require the product to be certified by an independent notified body, while others allow the manufacturer to carry out testing and make a declaration of conformity without requiring the use of a notified body. For example, Module A does not require a notified body, while for Module B, the use of a notified body is compulsory. Step 4. Test product to check conformity. You need to have the product tested to demonstrate that it meets the requirement of the regulation. For some low-risk products, you can use a traceable, accredited in-house test facility. However, most products require you to use an independent, accredited laboratory or test facility, which is accredited to a national body with responsibility for accreditation. In Ireland, this would be INAB, and in the UK, this would be UCAS. In other words, you need to use a test lab that is accredited for the standard that applies to your product. Step 5, nearly there. Once you have your test results and certificates, you need to compile the technical file. This will include details of the design and manufacture of the product, all test results and certificates, the notified body certificate if required, any other relevant technical documentation. You will generally be required to keep this information for 10 years and be able to give access to market surveillance authorities during that period. Last step, step number 6. Finally, you will need to draw up the Declaration of Conformity and attach the CE mark to your product. The Declaration of Conformity is a legal document where the manufacturer declares that the product meets the requirement of the regulation. The regulations set out what information must be included in the Declaration of Conformity, and the conformity mark can only be placed on products where it is required by EU legislation and must not be put on any other products. I am now going to talk about notified bodies. A notified body is an independent organisation that is designated by an EU member state to assess the conformity of certain products before being placed on the EU market. So what is the role of a notified body? The role is to conduct a conformity assessment under the relevant EU directives and regulations. The conformity assessment usually involves an audit of the manufacturer's quality system. Notified bodies must be accredited by the national accreditation body in the member state in which they are established, and accredited notified bodies are listed on the EU NANDO website. NANDO is short for New Approach, Notified and Designated Organisation. So notification is an act whereby a notifying authority in a member state informs the Commission and the other member states that a body which fulfills the relevant requirements has been designated to carry out conformity assessment according to a directive. In Ireland, the Department of Housing is the notifying authority for construction products, and the HPRA is the notifying authority for medical devices. Here is the homepage of the NANDO website. You can just simply Google NANDO and you will also find it. The member states, European Free Trade Association, known as EFTA, and EEA have designated notified bodies established per directive. Lists of notified bodies can be searched on the NANDO website. The lists include the identification number of each notified body as well as the tasks for which it has been notified and are subject to regular update. There are a number of ways to find a notified body on NANDO, and I'm going to take you through the various ways of doing that. Let us now search by legislation. Click the legislation button and you can see that there are 32 pieces of legislation, either a regulation or a directive. Here is a product, and you might ask, what is the legislation for this particular product? There are 3 pieces of legislation, but only 2 require that the product has to be certified or comply with 2 directives. One is for the electromagnetic capability, otherwise known as EMC, and the second one is the radio equipment directive. The third directive is for low voltage, so the product does not require a notified body to certify for that. Let's search now and give you an example of searching for under a particular directive and see how many notified bodies are for that. So we take the Measuring Instruments Directive of 2014. Here you can see under legislation that the Measuring Instruments Directive procedure comes here. These are the bodies. There are 115 notified bodies under that directive, and Ireland is a notified body for Measuring Instruments Directive. We can also search by country as a member state. So if I click on Ireland, if you want to find out who in Ireland is a notified body, you just click there and you will see from this particular piece of legislation, it lists out all the notified bodies based in Ireland, and you can see NSAI circled in green. And finally, if you want to do free search, finding a notified body, you can just key in the notified body number of the notifying body. You can key in for legislation, and that is a third way to carry out searching. The EU Declaration of Conformity is a legal document drawn up by the manufacturer or their authorised representative, if mandated to do so by the manufacturer. It must contain all of the information set out in the relevant legislation, and these include contact details of the manufacturer, contact details of an authorised representative, details of any notified body used in product certification, including the notified body number, the EU legislation which applies to the product, any harmonised European standards used to assess the conformity of the product, and all other relevant technical information. Now, where a product is covered by more than one piece of legislation, you only draw up one declaration, which should reference all of the legislation and their requirements. So here we have our smoke alarm again. There's a low voltage directive, and it is also covered under the EMC directive and a radio equipment directive. Under the construction products regulation, you draw up a declaration of performance rather than a declaration of conformity. The declaration of performance contains similar information and fulfills the same role. Applying the CE mark. Well, EU legislation is very specific about the use and misuse of the CE mark. It indicates that the product meets the basic requirements of the relevant legislation. It is not a quality mark and does not indicate that any product is better or worse than another product. It can only be used on products where the relevant EU legislation requires it to be used. Finally, it must follow the format set out in EU legislation. It must be legible, no smaller than 5 mm in size, in a contrasting colour and applied permanently to the product. For products that are too small, it may be applied to the packaging instead of the product. And here's a well-marked product. Here are some of the marks you will see, as the CE mark is in green. The notified body number 0086 is circled there in blue, and the harmonised standard against which the mask was tested is circled in red. The Blue Guide is a comprehensive guide to the operation of the EU single market for manufactured products. The latest Blue Guide builds on the content of the original guide, first published in 2000. The new version of the guide includes new chapters, for example, on the obligation of economic operators, which will be covered in Module 2, or accreditation. Completely revised chapters such as those on standardisation and market surveillance. It is available on the EU Commission website, and you can see the link below here. As I stated in my introduction, this is a simple introductory guide to CE marking, providing a simplified interpretation of very complex legislation across a range of products. Ultimately, the economic operator is responsible for compliance. If you have any further questions on CE marking, please contact NSAI. Thank you for your attention.